Welcome to the Modern Athenas podcast with Sonia and Debbie. This is episode 3 of our Human Computers cluster. This will be our last podcast in this cluster. Today, we're going to be covering questions from listeners and do some comparison and contrasting between Rise of the Rocket Girls, which we covered in podcast 1, and Hidden Figures, which we covered in podcast 2. Before we begin our discussion today, Sonia and I just wanted to take a moment to let you know that as a result of some great listener feedback, we're going to be changing the format of our podcast starting next podcast. We will be mostly moving away from doing clusters and moving to do individual books in order to be able to present a wider range of women and topics. We may still also do some clusters of historical periods throughout our future podcasting. We are excited to see where this approach will take us, and as always, we appreciate our listeners following along on our journey. So now let's go ahead and dive right into some discussion about the two books. First, we want to sort of discuss some of the differences beyond race between working at JPL and working in West Computing. So Langley is on the East Coast in Virginia, and it's always been a government organization, whereas JPL initially was not a government organization, though it obtained funding from various government entities. And that's really significant because it sort of is how the two entities run themselves and how they begin. The bureaucracy at Langley is much greater than the bureaucracy at JPL, and you saw that with the women and the work that they were doing. It was a much more collegial atmosphere at JPL, smaller, almost college or university-like, whereas Langley ran much more like what you would stereotypically see as a government organization. And Langley also focused on airplanes and JPL on rockets. So now and today, they both are part of NASA, but JPL still focuses more on robotic exploration of the universe, and Langley focuses on flight. So the differences between these organizations, I think, came through a little bit in the books.
Yeah, I was thinking about this bureaucracy versus college differences, and the Langley West Computing seemed kind of rigid and compartmentalized, and we've talked about that and how the women there didn't really have context for their work, whereas JPL had this relationship with, was it Caltech, and very much encouraged their staff to continue education, and it was very much community feel and seemed very open. And we'll talk more about how it was kind of a college atmosphere, but I felt that was a pretty stark difference.
Yeah, and I think too, Langley being a government entity, they're under civil service work rules, and yet JPL was much more informal. You definitely saw the women interacting with the engineers and the engineers interacting with computers. And then, as you were just mentioning, interacting with Caltech and outside entities, much different than at Langley. So Langley didn't have to worry about funding. It was all coming from the US government. JPL had to justify its existence by obtaining funding for different projects. And so in some ways, JPL, I felt was, at least through these books, was much more project oriented, and Langley seemed to be a much bigger bureaucracy and focused on a wider range of flight issues. So these differences, I think, also impacted the day-to-day work, and we saw that in both of the books. So the women at JPL seemed to be more involved in the whole entire process from start to finish of creating these rockets and seeing them succeed. Whereas the women of West Computing, like we talked about last week, it was much more compartmentalized. They were given a certain part of the project, but they never really saw the start or the finish.
And the women at JPL, you always heard about them on site near the rockets. They could always hear the sounds of the tests, and they seemed very connected to all parts, and it was that really translated to kind of the excitement and also the implication of their calculations, whereas the women seem at West Computing seem much more isolated. And I actually got a sense that the Langley campus was much bigger because of that, and JPL was much more intimate.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's definitely still a stereotype today that Southern California and working for the government in Southern California is much more informal in that college atmosphere than it is, say, working for the government in DC or related, sort of near DC. So it seems to still be that case a little bit. And, you saw it like at JPL. The engineers and the computers would gather in the afternoons to have popcorn and to kind of shoot the breeze with each other and talk about the projects. And they gave each other nicknames. And it was definitely just this much more collegial atmosphere. And you wonder what that did for the work. Because, we've talked about before, having a good working team can mean much more productive work. And so it got me wondering if in West Computing, which didn't seem to have that same sort of project team, at least in the beginning, during the World War II and period and a little bit after, I wonder how that impacted the work.
Well, and maybe and we'll talk more, of course, about race, but just if they hadn't been so isolated in West Computing, how the progress would have been different. Because it seemed like JPL, they were just kind of unleashed. And because the cultural stereotypes didn't seem to have as much of an impact on their work, they just didn't waste any time and were able to accomplish much over short periods of time.
Right. And like you just mentioned, I think that there's two different variables. There's the gender variable, and then there's the race variable. So, I kind of akin the JPL situation a little bit closer to East Computing, which was basically white women. And they were still also isolated from the engineers and from the projects, and they were doing compartmentalized work. And so I think that the isolation of the gender at Langley played a significant role in sort of the progression of the women in their career. So we've just been talking a little bit about the impact of the work that the computers were performing. And as you were mentioning, it's a much clearer path at JPL, or at least that was the way it was presented in the book, to get from the initial calculations of how are we going to create this rocket, what is it going to do, to watching the rocket in test flight, to looking at all the testing data, to then fixing and solving the problems, and then launching a successful rocket. Whereas in West Computing, I didn't get the impression that they really had any idea what their calculations were doing.
Well, it said they read the results in newspapers, right? They were completely closed off. It felt like in the beginning, and it wasn't till a decade into it when Katherine was able to work with John Glenn that she was finally, the connection was very short and she knew the whole process.
Right. I felt like when West Computing was disbanded and the women were moved into the project teams, that was starting to become a little bit closer to what JPL had from the start.
Mm-hmm.
And it was allowing them to sort of at least begin to see what is this project look like from start to finish. And I know, for myself, when I'm working on a team, being able to know from start to finish sort of where my work fits in and how it's impacting things and what the value of my work is, that's really important to me. And so I know that there are, government organizations today where people work with security clearances and they don't have that. It remains compartmentalized for security reasons. But I think for the most part, people on teams like to be able to see sort of what their work is doing.
I need a full understanding of where I'm going before I can really take that first step, because then once I start taking steps, I can kind of adjust on the move because I have the end goal in mind. And maybe I can be a little bit more creative in the process because I have a framework, whereas opposed to it's just dictated to me what to do. And I don't know, I got the sense that JPL was a very creative place, and they had to be, and West Computing was a much more utilitarian, rigid, task-oriented place.
Yeah, much more regimented in sort of the style and their method of work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that in JPL, the women were encouraged to participate in the whole project. And I use project as a term, but obviously, what I'm really getting at is, a rocket from sort of start to finish, or a specific grant or funding source that they had that they were doing specific work for. So I'm just using the project term loosely, but they were much more invested, I think, in putting extra effort and time and attention into the project than the women would have been in West Computing, because they weren't really working on quote projects in West Computing. They were more working on very compartmentalized groups of calculations. And so you could almost infer that the West Computing women worked a pretty standardized schedule, whereas over at JPL, they seemed to work morning until very late at night. And so I'm wondering if part of that was caused by the compartmentalization at Langley.
I bet so. I think that that became apparent that the women at JPL just kind of got fully immersed in their work, and the women at West Computing were completely committed to the work, but there was all these other issues that we'll talk about that created kind of a bulk of their day and how they could interact with people, and maybe took up a lot of their energy.
Yeah, and something that's really interesting is because Langley was civil service, in some ways, the women of West Computing had a career path. And in other ways, JPL, with the ability for them to be creative and sort of follow more of a squiggle kind of path or a branched journey, they seem to have an easier time of sort of getting a larger part of the project or becoming sort of self-promotion. And I don't know how much race played into that. The East Computing women certainly were part of the project teams earlier, which one could sort of indicate would mean that they were able to promote into engineers eventually sooner than the women of West Computing, because the women of West Computing weren't on the project teams as early. And so they weren't given those opportunities. But that sort of struck me, and I just wondered, for career progression purposes, how being part of civil service versus being more independent and less compartmentalized and regimented would have impacted that.
Well, and in the end, it almost seemed, I don't know if you agree with this, but the JPL women and the West Computing women, after a decade, almost ended up in the same place and being called engineers.
I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, when I say career progression, I don't mean actual, like what we today would see as career progression. I was more meaning sort of in terms of work amount and what they were able to sort of branch into and do. So you saw that the JPL women, yes, they were computers and they did all the calculations, but their opinions were taken into account, and they had great sort of higher level discussions with the engineers almost from the start. Whereas the women of West Computing, because they worked in this more regimented civil service situation that was so compartmentalized, never really got that opportunity.
Yeah, until that very end where we left, the book kind of takes us to Katherine and was it Mary at the end, but it took a lot longer. But then, yeah, it was interesting. I found that maybe that the end point was still very similar, but that journey to it was very different.
Right. And, another interesting difference between the two was how they got their jobs as computers. Because the West Computing women generally were working as teachers, or at least the examples that were presented in the book, the majority were teachers, because that was a profession that they could go into as an educated African-American woman at that time. And so they were coming from that and being working mothers into the Langley West Computing, whereas the women at JPL seemed to be coming either straight out of college or hadn't done college. And for a lot of them, JPL was their first job.
Yeah, and I remember some of the stories of the women at JPL. It was kind of a networking that they got word of the job, and they still had to win the job and interview, but they were kind of in this network of these highly educated elite mathematician engineer people, whether it was their brother or their friend. And whereas the Langley West Computing group of women seemed to have to make a geographical leap and also leap of faith to really even just take the job. It was really on their own merit. Of course, we talked about how competitive it was, but it seemed like they both approached it from different starting points.
Right. And certainly some of the difference for West Computing was that they were civil service. So they had to follow the civil service hiring practices, which were just different. I don't think they were better or worse. They were just different than the hiring practices at JPL. So JPL almost hired like a private corporation. And at the time, it seems like West Computing almost hired as a government entity. And those differences remain today. When you look at the way that you're hired to work for the U.S. government and the various agencies, you have to go through this whole hiring process that is meant to prevent discrimination and meant to provide equal opportunity to applicants. And there's some of it's a scoring process. Some of it gives better opportunities to certain groups of folks, whereas private industry doesn't have that tight of regulation around their hiring practices. I also think it was really interesting how the JPL women seemed to come in as individuals, and over time, they made this really great group with camaraderie and team, and sort of started to look to each other to build that network. Whereas the women of West Computing seemed to arrive already with a shared experience of having struggled, and the shared experience of wanting better for their families and themselves, and really looking at these temporary jobs, because they were temporary when they first took them, as opportunity for their families and for upward mobility.
Yeah, the women at JPL kind of formed their community at work, and the women in West Computing kind of had the community away from work to begin with. And the women at JPL kind of almost grew up together, and they started getting married and having kids at this about the same time. But I think the shared cultural experiences that the West Computing women had really probably strengthened their relationships, especially at work.
Right. And I don't know if it's just the way that the two books were written, but Hidden Figures seem to spend more time on discussing the out of work community that the women built for themselves. And, as I mentioned last week, they lived in racially segregated neighborhoods. So the women of West Computing, a lot of them lived near each other, and they would go to the same church and were involved in, scouting and community organizations together. And it seemed like the women at JPL, some of them lived close together, but there were others that lived a little further away. And like you said, their community was really rooted at the office, whereas the West Computing community was rooted outside of the office. And I just wonder what kind of impact that had to sort of their work life a little bit. And it wasn't, I don't think that the women of West Computing weren't a team. They very clearly turned to each other for support. But I just got this feeling that the women of JPL sort of lived and breathed and died by their work in a different way.
Also, their work hours at JPL were so long and extended. They pretty much lived there, and it just happened that they slept in their apartment. And whereas the kind of the rigidity and regulation of the Langley office, maybe with the shorter work hours, enabled the women of West Computing to have their community life really at home, and both benefited them, I think, in their work. And they both obviously contributed greatly.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it appeared from the book that the women of West Computing, home was almost like the solace for them. They had these very tight-knit communities around them that supported them and helped them, and they really embodied this idea of it takes a village to raise a child, and they would rely on relatives and neighbors and community support to raise their children while they were working in West Computing, whereas the women of JPL, it seemed when they had children, they left JPL. They didn't have that sort of tight-knit support community around them.
Yeah, and there was the kind of lack of community, but also the intense work that the JPL women had, and which negatively affected some of their at-home relationships. There was the one woman, was it Miriam, said, okay, now I go home and now I go to work, because the relationships that some of these women had were really strained, I guess, because their work kind of tipped the balance.
Yeah, and I think that it's a very sort of stereotypical of government v. private organization today, right? And so stereotypical government civil service job has more regulated hours. Private jobs, the hours start to sort of bleed into creating not such a good work-life balance. Again, that's absolutely a stereotype, but I think you saw it a little bit in these two groups. Before JPL really became a government organization and part of NASA, the hours were long, the benefits were not in terms of compensation benefits, but benefits in terms of work benefits were great. The women were incredibly invested in their work. They, as you mentioned, sort of lived and breathed at work. Whereas the women of West Computing, I felt like were less invested in those projects because they didn't really know what their work was doing. And as you mentioned, they read about their work in magazines. And so in essence, they almost were able to clock in and clock out a bit better, and have a better work-life balance.
So Debbie, which of those experiences have you closely had?
Well, it's interesting because I've had them both. I now have a closer job type of job to the West Computing women, where the hours are more regular. There isn't as much work on weekends. You're not expected to be at work and sort of on the clock 12 hours a day. You're also not necessarily tied to your cell phone now, right? I've been thinking a little bit about cell phones because obviously this was before the time of cell phones, but I just wondered today, how the whole tied to your smartphone, answer your email at all hours of the day would have impacted these two groups of women, and whether that would have caused both of them to actually work even more than they did. But I currently have a job that's much better work-life balance. As an attorney, I had a job that you were basically on the clock 24/7. If you weren't at the office, you were tied to your office by your cell phone and your email. You were expected to be available to meet client needs. Your calendar was on the whim of the courts. Lots of high priority issues to take care of at the same time. Work hours were long. You could see projects through, so you saw a lot of good benefit in your work, and you wanted to work really hard because you wanted to always do great work for clients. And you could sort of see, like the JPL women could see the rockets from sort of initial calculations through final liftoff. As an attorney, I got to see cases from when they were initiated all the way through to trial. So you were really invested in that process. And now I have a job where it's a bit more compartmentalized. The work that I do, I can see the impact, but I don't have that sort of project-based work from like a case from start to finish like I used to. What about you?
Well, I've been in arts management my whole career, so working for an orchestra, and because it's nonprofit and salaried positions, there's definitely the tendency to put in a lot of hours. In my previous job, I was much more in the weeds of the details, and before I was a mother, I had a lot more time on my hands that I could kind of use for me at work, and I did. So I actually had to kind of regulate my own hours once I became a mother, and I wanted to become more efficient at work and try to be really rigid about my hours. And so that's actually kind of stuck now. And the challenge there is to try to still maintain a high level of work that can be done with an enormous amount of hours, but be very efficient about it and put my own boundaries around it. So that's been my goal over the last 3 years since Ethan was born.
Yeah, and you talk about that work-life balance, and I think that goes, I think a lot of women are struggling with that. Whether or not you have kids or a spouse, there is that constant pull of, do I spend more time at work and get better at work and do more to continue up the career ladder, or do I take the time to take care of myself at the expense of my job? And I think that a lot of women struggle with how to find a point that they're at peace with. And in my former job as an attorney, I never found that balance. And part of that was because I was so invested in the cases, and the trial teams were so invested in what was happening that, like the women at JPL, you lived your life at work because that's really where the pressure to be sort of was. And sure, people had families, but again, you were spending the majority of your waking hours at the office. Whereas in my current job, everybody is very, very invested in the work, but there's a respect for having a work-life balance and for making sure that you're taking care of yourself, and to make sure that you are, spending your weekend away so that you're coming back ready to go and hit the ground running on Monday. And it's just a very different type of atmosphere. And I wouldn't say one is better than the other. I would say they both have their benefits, and they both have sort of their disappointments or consequences, you could say. So one of the questions that we received in from a viewer or a listener very early on was whether or not there was racial segregation at JPL like there was at Langley. And I think that the listener at the time had seen the Hidden Figures movie, but we hadn't yet had our Hidden Figures podcast to sort of talk about those racial differences that we saw at Langley. But we only have anecdotal evidence of one African-American woman that was in the computer groups at JPL. And I may mispronounce her name, but it's spelled Janez. Let me read you a quote from the Rise of the Rocket Girls book, because I think it's sort of tells a little bit about her experience at JPL. So she had no expectation that she'd ever be able to recreate the joyful mix of camaraderie and science after her experiences at UCLA. However, she found JPL and became the first African American hired for a professional position at the Institute. Her mother fretted over her driving the distance from Santa Monica to JPL every day, even suggesting that she find a job closer to home. But Janez wouldn't hear of it. She had found a special group of women to work with at JPL, and she knew this kind of professional position wouldn't be easy to find elsewhere. Still, she must have sometimes been lonely on that long drive. She was the only African American in the group, and her commute was symbolic of how much further she had come than many of her colleagues. And in another quote, we have Janez confided to Marie that she loved working with scientists. Scientists are less prejudiced, she said. They're caught up in all these things that the average person isn't even interested in. Marie laughed because she couldn't agree more. And so I think you have a very different circumstance going on at JPL than you did at West Computing. So Janez was integrated in the computing group. Where the integration fell apart was that she lived so far away in an African American community in Santa Monica, whereas a lot of the white women at JPL lived very close to JPL.
Yeah, and I think her presence kind of changed things a little bit, because I think there was a quote after she had arrived when maybe it was Barbara who was hiring another woman computer and asked that woman, "How do you feel about working with a colored woman?" And because I think at this point it was established that she was part of the group, so they wanted to make sure everybody coming in was also going to support that.
Yeah, and I think it was a big difference from Langley. And part of that difference is geographic. So California tends to be more racially integrated throughout history than does the East Coast. And Virginia in particular at that time was incredibly segregated, and it had a governor that was very supportive of racial segregation. So it was this total difference in sort of in how the women were operating, just I think also based on those society or geographic differences.
Yeah, and there was also Helen at JPL. She was Chinese, I believe, and so it seemed even one more level of diversity out there, and it was just like what she said, she liked the engineers. Janez liked the engineers because they weren't as prejudiced. I think that was apparent from the beginning, that the work was not kind of tainted by these cultural stereotypes and prejudices as much, obviously, as Langley was, being in the segregated South.
Yeah, and originally I thought, well, maybe this was a difference between civil service government job at Langley versus private job at JPL. And then I realized probably not, because just at the time, the way that segregation was in Virginia, no one really saw anything wrong with, it seems, with having both East Computing and West Computing. Like, it didn't seem abnormal to segregate the women by race. Whereas at JPL, it seems that would have been an anomaly. Even if more African American women had been hired, no one really thought to segregate them. And so I just think that it's interesting, sort of those societal differences.
Yeah, segregation in Langley was so strong, and even if people felt maybe they would have been more at home in the JPL integrated kind of open feel, they were kind of had to adhere to these rules. And there was the one supervisor, was it Kaz, that he was, he kind of broke down those barriers, but it was kind of a really big deal that he did. And at JPL, that was kind of expected, that you would just work with everybody, and that really helped form that collegial atmosphere.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting that Janez was given the opportunity to work with the rest of the computers. And I know that, we were speaking about, 10 years forward, the career tracks for the two groups of women seem similar. But I just really do wonder, like for Janez, being able to integrate earlier, did that help her in any way? Or did she feel like it was awkward or different? And we got a little flavor that her community was in Santa Monica, and here she was working in Pasadena. And if you know anything about Southern California, it's a long way to travel for a day's work. You're going right through heart of traffic, and even in the 60s, right through, bumper to bumper rush hour traffic. And so she had this sort of geographic separation even from her team at JPL when she wasn't there. And yet the opportunities for her seem more than the women at West Computing who geographically were together both at work and outside of work in their racially segregated areas.
Yeah, it seemed like they did have different experiences just by nature of California and Virginia. I think it must be the geographical difference, but I did feel that Jenez still had kind of that isolation, like you said, this geographical separation, just the long commute. And I think that ultimately when she became a mother, she there was no way she was going to be able to manage kind of both.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really interesting sort of a dichotomy. So you have on the West Coast these women who were working for, at that time, again, not a government entity, who didn't have the option of sick leave or, vacation time at the same way that the civil service women did. So you saw when the women at JPL would have a child, they had to leave JPL, and Jenez was no exception. Yet the African-American women in West Computing had children and returned to work very soon after having children and kept their job and employment. So you saw two very different experiences of the African-American women raising their children, depending on what coast they were on, but also depending on what type of organization they were working for.
And it was very clear to say in Hidden Figures that the women at West Computing were bringing in income that their family depended on. So there was that kind of this really financial pressure that I didn't ever get the sense the women at JPL had.
Yeah, I didn't get the sense that they were the sole breadwinner for their family. I mean, certainly when they were young and single, they were likely supporting themselves. But there were a couple of instances in Rise of the Rocket Girls where the author was speaking about some of the husbands and the careers of the husbands. And you'll remember the one computer in particular who married an engineer and then ended up divorcing from the engineer. But that their husbands had careers that were supporting the family. Whereas, like you mentioned, in West Computing, often these women were the primary provider for their families. And it's interesting that you can go all the way back to that time when that was not necessarily a national norm. Men were considered to work outside of the home and women inside of the home. And so this idea that these African-American women were out there and were supporting their sometimes large families was pretty incredible.
Yeah, I think the statistic was 20% of women worked outside the home in like 1950. And so all these groups of women at JPL and at Langley were definitely breaking down these gender barriers that were all nationwide. And so that was definitely something that they both had in common. Whether their experiences in detail were similar, it didn't really matter. They were still progressing mankind and human and womankind forward in their experiences.
Yeah, and just the work ethic that both groups exhibited. I mean, I know we've spoken about the compartmentalized work versus, project work, but the actual work ethic that they had was incredible. And I just think, if women could harness that today, and, some women do, but if we could, as a sort of group, just harness that energy, what kind of work we could do.
Well, and I think the takeaways for me that both these groups of women showcased was hard work, exactly, excellence, the quality of that work, persistence, courage, and community, and supporting each other. And we've talked about the teamwork aspect and how building up your team really is going to essentially ensure the success of a project or mission.
Right. And I think that their perseverance through challenges was from what was really struck me in both of the books. And the fact that, through their work challenges, when their calculations weren't going right, and it wasn't that the calculations were wrong, it was just that the product of the result of the calculations wasn't necessarily, getting the rockets off the launch pad at JPL or getting probably the planes to fly at Langley, though it was, again, a little less clear, what aspects of that work the calculations were for. But the fact that the women just day in and day out just sort of grinded and did these calculations and persevered through the challenges that they were facing. And like the one West computer where the head or deputy head of Langley was like, no, your calculations are wrong. And she said, my calculations are good. Let's look at the input and not look at the output. And as it turns out, the input wasn't accurate. And just sort of that steadfast perseverance through those challenges really made me reflect on my own life and think, what are those opportunities that we have when we come across those barriers or those walls in our work or in our home life? And we, instead of, trying to go over the wall or around the wall, we just stand there and we sort of look at the wall and we're like, wow, this is unfortunate, or this is disappointing, or let's turn back and go a different road, rather than exploring, different options to sort of persevere through the challenge.
And I think another thing that I've been thinking about is how these two stories really showcase that humans actually kind of have a similar experience, even though if the details or the circumstances maybe look different and you might be thinking you don't have anything in common with someone because on the surface, something might just look different than the way you're experiencing life. In the end, these women both triumphed through adversity. They persisted, like you said, and they contributed greatly. And after a decade's worth of work, they were kind of all in this similar place, and as a gender and as they were really pressing through and up the chain of command in science. And so I don't know if I articulated that very well, but it's that actually just now has really dawned on me as an important thing to open my eyes to how someone's experience might actually be very similar to my own.
Yeah, and I think for sure, their ability to just continually push and not knowing where they were going to go. So I think a lot of us have this tendency, I sure do, of wanting to know where I'm at and wanting to know where I'm going and all the little steps in between to get me there. I'm very goal oriented in that way. But these women had no idea where their work was going. They had no idea where their careers were going. And they took this leap of faith and just allowed themselves the opportunity to just grow organically and just follow their dreams and sort of see where it was going. And I walked away with that thinking how many different opportunities maybe I've missed in my life because I've been unwilling to sort of take that leap of faith. And recently, in the past 18 months, I took a major leap of faith when I left my career as an attorney to try. Now I'm a compensation manager. And so that was an absolute leap of faith, and it's working out great. And so I just wonder to myself, like looking forward, how many times I need to just remind myself it's okay not to always know where the path is taking you, but to take that leap of faith and have faith in yourself and your skills and your abilities to be able to make something great of an opportunity that may come your way and not to shy away from it. So one of the things that we did these past couple of podcasts and weeks as we've been going through these books was to solicit some answers and questions from our listeners. And one of the questions that we put out there was whether actions or words are more effective when responding to a negative stereotype.
Yeah, and Sarah Armstrong from Twitter, she said, I think they are equally important, meaning actions and words. Actions speak volumes, but it's important to explain the why sometimes. For instance, people often think that if someone owns a gun and knows how to use it, that makes a person a gun nut. I believe that's a negative stereotype. And Sarah and I have talked a little bit about this because we're both firearms owners, and it is a negative stereotype that we both have been up against. But, I know she and I agree that trying to explain the why can sometimes help get our point across. For instance, the why is to try to prepare to save a life. But I've also found that explaining why it's never going to change someone's mind. So I try to simply kind of disprove the stereotype. And that can be through actions and words. For instance, I just simply try to live a life of accountability and compassion and humility. And so when people find out that I'm a gun owner, they're completely surprised because they don't think that fits the stereotype at all, when in fact, I'm trying to show that the stereotype is inaccurate and irrelevant. So my point in all of this is that stereotyping in general never seems to consider the whole person's character. that we're judging. And I think we could learn a lot about someone if we actually considered that stereotypes are inaccurate. And I definitely saw that in the women computers when they prove stereotypes wrong through their actions, showcasing their brilliance and strength when the expectation was that they were weak and dependent.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you were to meet Sonia, just for our listeners, you would not peg her as a gun owner. She's feisty. She's, what are you, 5 foot nothing? She's buff. She's awesome, but you wouldn't look at her and be like, oh, she's a gun owner. And Sarah, if you talk to Sarah, you also wouldn't necessarily peg Sarah as a gun owner. So finding out both of them were gun owners for me was very interesting because I didn't think that I had any stereotype about what I believed a gun owner was until I met Sonia and talked to Sarah, and I realized, wow, I have a lot of stereotypes about what I think gun owners are. And it made me reflect on the idea that how many stereotypes we hold or implicit biases that we hold about things and about people and don't even know that we have them because we're never forced to sort of address them. Or forced to look at them in a different way. And, I got me thinking about stereotypes that people have had of me. Sometimes I find it enjoyable to sort of remove that stereotype from their thought process once they meet me and they get to know me, and it's like, oh, you're not what I thought you were, or oh, whatever category I had you put in, you're not. Other times I find it really exhausting. And, I think that's maybe what you were speaking to a little bit about the why. Explaining the why to people sometimes for me just gets tiring. Why did you leave your legal career? To be honest, we could have an entire podcast on why Debbie left her legal career, but no one's that interested in it. But rather than that, it's, well, let me show you what I've done since I left my legal career and the types of things that I'm doing now. And maybe that explains why I left a little bit, or at least provides you a different insight. But it made me also wonder about, in both of these books, what sorts of stereotypes the male engineers had about the women that they weren't even aware of. And sort of how those stereotypes were broken down over time, especially at JPL, by interacting with the women.
Well, and I think in those stories, when someone was surprised or seemed to exceed expectations, that was actually now a big red flag for me, that there was a stereotype there. There was an expectation that was too low, or some broad label that existed. And so I've been thinking about that. When have I been surprised by someone because I thought they were a certain way? And so I have to think about some of the stereotypes that I know I have thought of. But I just wanted to showcase Lisa Byers from Twitter. She gave us kind of another way to respond to negative stereotypes. I think what she's doing in this response that I'll talk about is kind of stripping that stereotype of its power. She said that she's been called a Bible nut or assumed to be racist because she's from Alabama, but she actually tends to just laugh it off and not take these stereotypes too seriously. And I think when we don't give those stereotypes weight in our lives, then they lose kind of the steam and power that they might have for someone else.
Certainly, and it removes their power that they have over us. So one of the other questions that we asked was, have you experienced camaraderie in the workplace? Did it help accomplish work better? Does gender matter in workplace camaraderie or in teams?
So Robert Vaughn from Twitter says he thinks gender makes a significant difference on teams. Each brings a unique insight to the problem. However, leadership needs to be aware that this can cause increased competition, which, if harnessed, can be good, but if not, can cause division. But overall, he thinks camaraderie is a great thing in the workplace, and having someone you consider a friend helps you have a sense of belonging and allows you to bounce ideas off and provides a feeling of inclusion. And I would go on to say camaraderie gives me an enjoyable experience at the waking hours of work. I try to promote on my team the idea that we're all here and we're all spending our waking hours together. Let's make this an enjoyable experience by having that camaraderie.
Right. And Mandy Huber actually, she works in a worked in a critical care unit at a hospital. And she says, we had camaraderie down to a science. And that comment made me laugh a little bit because I felt that way about my trial teams when I was an attorney, that you had to have camaraderie down to a science because the work itself was so pressurized that if you couldn't turn to your team for support, you were going to collapse. There was no way you could do it on your own, and the power of many was stronger than the power of one. And gender played all kinds of roles and all kinds of reasons, less so in terms of camaraderie on the team, but definitely I think that the different genders being different things to the team, as like Robert was mentioning.
Yeah, and Charlotte Allen from Twitter was talking a little bit about how she did notice kind of a difference between genders, but when everybody kind of focused on carrying their own load and being competent and kind of on the mission, she felt that all kind of all fell away.
Yeah, and I think that that's definitely true to a point. I think that probably, like Mandy's experience in critical care or my experience as an attorney, once you get that team cohesion put in place or put together, you start to focus on the mission or the trial or the whatever the purpose of that team is, and less on the differences or the unique things that traits that each of you has that you've brought to the team, because you're basically like you were just mentioning, laser focused on what you're going to accomplish all together. So the last question that we asked of our listeners: in the 1950s, women of JPL were told by their women's supervisor to, quote, look like a girl, act like a lady, think like a man, and work like a dog in order to succeed. So we asked folks, do you think that those elements contribute to success in today's society? And would the same be said in 2017, or would a different phrase be used now?
And Jordan Green from Twitter, I really liked what he had to say. It made a lot more sense to me when it was put this way. He kind of interpreted that phrase to mean look respectable, act professionally, think with detachment, and prioritize and execute, which is a good method for both men and women. And but Sarah Brambila, she kind of got hung up on the act like a lady. She said that really kind of bothered her because it sounded like it was a prescription to be gentle and make coffee and don't have expectations. So I think the interpretation of these phrases as they're worded is still really important.
Yeah, and Sarah's comment made me laugh because if you meet Sarah, she's also 5'0", just a spitfire personality. So I could see where sort of acting like a lady, she's a scientist, and I know that she's encountered gender stereotypes in her work. So her comment made me chuckle because I definitely see in sciences that portion of it could have an impact. I was also really taken aback by Liz's comment.
So Liz, she said that after being at Smith College for 4 years, which is where you went, right? That's a all-women's college.
Right.
And it was really hard to complete her prerequisites for pharmacy school, where the majority of the student population was male. She left this environment of women's education at Smith and where she was nurtured and respected, and arrived at a school where she was feeling belittled and even verbally abused. And while no one said it was because she was a woman, she really felt it was. But she worked like a dog. She worked really hard and it paid off. She had the highest test scores, even though no one knew because the test scores were identified by ID number. But no one knew that she was getting these highest test scores, and they treated her like she was an idiot. She felt really because she was a woman, but she persevered and tried to continue to act like a lady, held her head high, and gritted her teeth, and eventually it was over. So it sounded like she really connected to this phrase.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting dichotomy, because where Liz went to college, which is where I went to college, it's all women. So she says, you have this great camaraderie, and women are just very respected and nurtured and encouraged to pursue anything that they can dream about. And it's just a very uplifting and positive atmosphere to be in for your education. And then she goes to this co-ed school that's entirely different. And it's a little bit of shock trauma almost. I experienced something very similar when I went to law school. Because again, having been at Smith, where it's just all women, go get them, absolutely no barriers to what you want to do. I mean, Smith encourages women to get out and reach for the stars. And it's incredible what the alumni of Smith are out there in the world doing. But you go from that to a law school where you have to even wonder, is my gender impacting how I'm being treated? It's a very interesting transition.
Well, and the last contribution we have is actually from my dad, Hollis Thomes, who's a avid listener of the Modern Athenas podcast. I really thought he had an interesting take on the phrase as applying the phrase to both men and women, meaning he says, I think that what makes for a person richer in character, no matter what the sex, is a merging of these stereotypical traits. Women can look like a girl and act like a lady, but also think like a man and work like a dog to be successful. But men also need to take on positive feminine traits like being relational and empathetic in order to be successful at work.
Yeah, and I think that that's really pretty much spot on, because I don't think that any of us live on this gender sort of trait spectrum where we're all woman or all male all the time, or most people don't. Yes, we've all seen the ones that do, but generally people have traits of what would be sort of stereotypically seen as male or female traits. And those traits end up helping you relate to people or to the other gender in particular, I think, better. And so it's realizing that, being able to, like, as your dad was saying, have the relationship with people is really what's of primary concern, whether they're male or female.
And we're all on teams with men and women, I'm sure by now. Everybody is. And so we have to be able to just know how to relate to a diverse group of people, personalities, emotional intelligences, love languages, whatever you want to call it. We just have to be open and diverse in the way we're going to interact with people, I think, in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's absolutely true. And I think that, again, I look back at the women of JPL in particular and the camaraderie that they had in their team and the camaraderie with the engineers that they built. And I think that is almost a perfect, and I don't like to use the word perfect because, that implies that there was nothing wrong, but it was a great example of what you can build for a team, and the kind of work and the quality of work that you can have when you have a team that's working so well together. So on that note, that's all that we have for today's podcast. So we'd like to thank you for listening and downloading and sharing this first cluster on human computers with us. If you'd like to connect with us or you want to send in your questions or comments, we have our website at modernathenas.com, our Facebook page, which is under Modern Athenas, so give us a like on Facebook, and also our Twitter account at Modern Athenas. Feel free to ask any questions or give us any kind of feedback on the podcast, because we're really interested in hearing from you, what you've thought about these first three. So our website also will have some additional links and information related to this cluster and also the books going forward. So our next podcast we're very excited about. We're going to be discussing the book Harriet Tubman by Katherine Clinton, and a link to the book will be on our website. As we leave you today, we want to remind you to never forget that each of you, like each of the Modern Athenas we've discussed in these two books, has the power and capacity to be a change maker in your own world. Work hard, dream big, and reach for the stars.